Well, I like your. It's really funny, but I can really qualify. I can really qualify how much I like my wife. This is not an excuse. Isn't really not an excuse for you to escape from your wife. And anyway, uh, um, so I really like Fanwell's comment. And the point we need to keep in mind is that demand-driven is an exercise, political exercise, is actually very much challenged. It's very much challenged by the reality of rise of difference among the source. For instance, like China and India. I'm not going to say China and India are no longer in the position to continue this demand-driven exercise, but this is not my point. My point is that demand-driven itself is being challenged. It's being challenged. You cannot say, because the reason why it is challenged because of some context changed. 1960s, when see 1960s, we see simply the sharing experiences, demand-driven. So it's easy to apply demand-driven because the context, because the scope of the exercise was very, very narrowed. But today, the social cooperation in terms of any form is very much materialized, is very much capitalized, and is full of these countries' interesting countries' global politics, countries' interests, everything. Therefore, my point here is that we need to look carefully the demand-driven, and to also get lessons from the exercise for mutual accountability. Stephen, mutual accountability was developed based on the similar issues. And today, as my country at least publicly start to ask similar as the issue of accountability. And accountability is very complicated. That is heavily weighted by the domestic politics in all countries, as long as you provide a very heavy weight, not simple things. Therefore, my point is that in terms of measured social cooperation, we need to look at those contexts and those issues.
Thank you. Professor Melindo.
Well, there have been a lot of takeaways from the discussion today. I am not going to make a list of that, but I would just like to mention a very interesting exercise that we have been carrying out in terms of assessment of outcome of SSC from India. We are having, you might have noted, we are having a Young Scholars Forum organized. And this is an attempt to assess the outcome of the ITech programs that we have been carrying out in RIS for the last 5-7 years. So we tried to develop their capacity, and now we are trying to find out as to what has been the outcome in terms of contributing to the process of their capacity development process. So you can take that also as an example, an exercise in having an assessment of the impact or outcome, as you may call it, of an ITech program in the capacity building component of India.
Thank you, Professor Melindo. Noel.
Thank you. Very brief points. First, what we measure, we can improve. What we measure, we can actually seize, and then move forward. Why do we need to assess? I mean, we can and we do have methodologies for measuring quality and quantity of South-South cooperation. We do that nationally. We don't, I mean, we are beyond that debate. And we do that because we are accountable to our own public, but we are also accountable towards the international community in the frame of the SDGs. And what I would say is that there is of course, a lot of differences in between North-South, even in between the vision of South-South providers. However, there are some common standards. Technical cooperation, we all agree. Academic exchanges, we all agree. Financial support, we all agree. So let's work on what we actually have in common, and that is a lot. And the place to do that, I would say, is the United Nations. I think that the follow-up to the Buenos Aires conference provides us a good opportunity for exchanging our experiences in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Costu?
Oh, if I need to pick up only one issue, and there has been lots of discussion and lessons learned from this session, is that of relevance of participation and participatory approaches. And primarily because if the men's participation is mainstream, there are lots of issues related to the accountability can be addressed too. And second is that I don't see a contradiction between the representative democracy and the participatory democracy structure. They, in fact, complement each other. And therefore, I was not talking about participation from the outside, but participation from the community and community at a large, and therefore, including, that includes civil society, that includes the people's representatives in a consultative manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Kostov. Friends, I am very glad and very happy. Kostov mentioned of participation. Initially, when I opened the round, I said I would pick up first 5, and eventually I ended up with 14 questions. So I'm very happy with those 14 questions, and they were each very qualitative interventions. So it was not just quantity, but quality. And that, I think, is the intent of the South-South cooperation. I won't venture into its summary of the session, but definitely 2 issues are there in my mind, though we thought 1.5 hours for a session, and that's why we started pretty early at 8:30. Probably we should have done it at 8 o'clock. We could have covered issues related to, because today we largely covered G2G assistance of South-South cooperation. We haven't talked about what civil society is doing, and I'm very glad and thankful to Butch Montes for reminding us the role that is to be played, learning from our lessons from institutions that implemented a structural adjustment program, consulted civil society in an isolated manner. I think it has to be part of a structured dialogue, and we have to see how governments and civil society are part of that deliberation. We also need to see that governments take up the idea of impact assessment that we are discussing here, because we are, after all, academics. We are not governments. So we are discussing this, and I hope the discussion and the summary that we would come up on Friday, as I announced, today we are holding this session. Tomorrow on Saturday, full half day we have given for a workshop where we would be discussing these issues in further detail. And those of you who are staying back, please do join us for that workshop. It's very informal, but we are going to discuss the nuances of the methodology in further detail. So those who are interested are most welcome. I close here. We break for 15 minutes and we are back here for the next session. Thank you. A big hand to my panel. Chair and co-chair and all the speakers here, so we would start the session because we have to close for the next panel well in time. So this is exactly 11:15, Professor Kundu. We are not delayed, so please start, and we would have to bring it well in time without any discount to your panel or to chair, co-chair. So please start and finish in time. Thank you.
बताइए आधा हॉल खाली खाली पड़ा हुआ है दैट्स व्हाट ही सेड 15 के बाद में वो मैं डर्टी लुक देना शुरू करूँ
बिल्कुल डर्टी लुक नहीं उससे हम पत्थर फेंकने शुरू करते हैं
Dignitaries on and around the dais, participants, friends, colleagues, we begin this plenary session, and my responsibility of setting the context for the discussion has become relatively simpler. I have a very able co-chair who discussed with me the details of logistic arrangements, and I think he's very competently going to handle. And also, I have a keynote speaker, and I'm sure some of the issues which we are going to take up will figure. I just wanted to make a couple of remarks by the way of setting the context. Given the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, friends, I believe that there has never been a time of greater promise and also never been a time of greater potential destruction and destabilization. The crucial question, therefore, is whether the market, the decision makers, and the people who are often trapped in the conventional thinking and a linear logic, would they be able to strategically shape out, move towards a bright future through innovation by avoiding the forces of destabilization and disruption? Would we be in a position to design successful optimal strategy, and what kind of skill development, skills transformation would be required? In the most pessimistic, dehumanized form, the fourth industrial revolution may have the potential of robotizing the humanity and thus deprive us of our heart and soul. But on the other hand, it can also strengthen and complement the best parts of human nature, the creativity, empathy, and stewardship. It can lift humanity into a new collective and moral consciousness based on shared sense of destiny. Given this perspective, I think what we will be discussing is what are the challenges. We have the responsibility here in the panel to discuss whether the existing skilling mechanism are relevant and effective, particularly for the developing countries. Second, what sort of technological transfers can take place to help overcome these challenges? And third, how to work towards evolving the international institutions for higher learning to deal with the technological challenges. I broadly thought these are three areas of concern, but we would very much like to benefit from the keynote's presentation of Dr. Rajat Kathuria. May I welcome him to do that. Just 1 minute you give. We thought that he will take 15 to 20 minutes. He has volunteered to do that. Other panelists, we can make your initial observations, restrict that to 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up, and then we'll probe deeper into the issue that you're raising in the course of the discussion in a participatory manner. May I request Dr. Kathuria to take the floor.
Thank you, Professor Kundu, and good morning, everybody. Before I start, let me sort of profusely thank Sachin, my old friend, and his colleagues for inviting me, and it's an absolute honor to be able to deliver the keynote address on what I think is an extremely important session, especially in the context of South-South cooperation. So that I'm sort of surrounded by excellent chairs, co-chair, and speakers on the dais. So what I thought I'd do is, as Professor Kundu said, I'll set the context based on some work that we're doing, in our institution, and some of the work that has been going on in the world on this extremely important topic. So I think the new industrial revolution, the sort of future of work, and the scope of cooperation are all three sort of important contemporary, topics that if we don't sort of make the best use of technology, then I feel that the fourth industrial revolution will not be as successful as the past has been. The past industrial revolutions have been. So if you look at the context of economic growth of countries, one thing stands out. If you look at 200 years of economic growth, very well documented in some of the research articles that have come out in, particularly the Quarterly Journal of Economics or Foreign Affairs, that the only sustainable way to grow for countries is technological change or technological progress. And we've seen that from the first industrial revolution, where you sort of had textile workers converted into weavers' homes, and you had factories. Then you had the second industrial revolution, pretty much led by Henry Ford, and the automobile, where you had mass production. And then you had the third industrial revolution, which began in the 80s, which was digital. And I think the fourth industrial revolution, while it builds on the third industrial revolution, I think, as Professor Kundu was saying, it sort of creates a hugely and a massively disruptive effect on what it means for us as citizens, what it means for workers, and what it means for society, and of course, what it means for governments. And I think each of the stakeholders will have to respond in a manner that leverages, and it's going to be extremely hard to do, because there are controversies, there are contestations already out in the open. And I'm not just talking about the declining power of trade unions that I will speak about, the increasing wage inequality, the anti-globalization, and whatever else you see around. I think it's been quite well documented that the manifestations or the sort of the foundations of this change actually lie in technology. So, and the rest are sort of happening as a result of the massive changes that we see in technology. And so although the fourth industrial revolution is conceptualized, as I said, as an upgrade on the third industrial revolution, we have to distinguish it because we don't know, we have no idea how it's going to unfold. And it will disrupt almost every sector, every industry, and every country. And the reason it will do so is, I think if you look at the third industrial revolution, it sort of changed the way we work because machines took over the tasks that were sort of repetitive and routine tasks and the sort of non-cognitive tasks. But the fourth industrial revolution, what it's doing is it's also taking over some of the other tasks that were intrinsically human in nature, which is the recognitions of patterns. And here I'm talking about AI and machine learning. And cloud computing and big data have made it that you've accumulated so much knowledge which is stored in cloud computers that, for example, IBM's Watson computer now provides automated chronic care and cancer treatment diagnostics, drawing upon piles of data that a doctor would not be able to process, including information from more than 1.5 million patient records and clinical trials, as well as 2 million pages of text from medical journals. And this is sort of documented in journal articles. AI can also be seen in the progress of driverless cars, drones, virtual assistants, as well as softwares that translate or invest. Systems integration and additive, which is also known as 3D manufacturing, 3D printing, can already use prototypes to create finished components without human intervention. Thus, it appears, as Professor Kundu was saying, that the fourth industrial revolution is like no other. And therefore, I think the uncertainty surrounding it. So, what is it that is happening? I mean, what are the sort of manifestations of this change? And as I said, there are so many articles that have been written, but there are two broad competing effects that one observes in the literature. One competing effect is the alarmist view, which is that it's going to replace human labor and spell the end of human work. And the second is that it can be argued that technological changes have increased the demand for labor and wages, and there is no reason, like in the past, to be alarmist about this. And the reality, of course, lies somewhere, I guess, as always, in between. You know, one of the things that I can tell you is a couple of years ago when the World Bank had come out of its report on many countries, including India, there was a headline result from their research which suggested that 69% of India's manufacturing workforce was under threat of automation. Now, that's alarmist. Now, you know, when you have alarmist views like that, it's not good for policymakers and governments because the government say, well, gee, there's nothing that I can do about this because it's so pervasive, it's so intense, and it's so large that it's going to be impossible to actually take care of this. And I think the alarmist views do a disservice not only for citizens and workers, but also I think they do a disservice for policymakers as well, because then, as I said, you become a little disheartened about whether you can address this. So there are the two competing effects. One in the literature has been called, as I was saying, it's been called the displacement effect. And that's sort of top of the mind in everybody. So whoever you talk to in terms of researchers, that the displacement effect is going to be sort of important, paramount, and if that's the case, then it's going to be difficult times ahead. But what is slightly underappreciated and sort of less talked about is that, like in the past industrial revolutions, there could be a reinstatement effect. Now, the question is, how soon will this reinstatement effect happen? Because what happens with technologies is that you increase the demand, and once there's an increase in demand, not for sort of increased capital accumulation, there will be an increase in demand, not necessarily for the workers of the past, but for jobs of the future. And here, it's been variously caused as deepening of automation, which causes a productivity effect, which leads to more workers being hired. And you know, there are jobs that demand proximity to, you know, caregivers, etc., that often one hears about and talks about in television debates and channels, as well as in popular newspaper articles. But in journals, the sort of jargon that has been used is that there are jobs of an AI trainer, there's jobs of an artificial intelligence trainer, there are jobs of artificial intelligence explainers, there are jobs related to artificial intelligence sustainers. And while sort of these jobs will be there, they'll be created, you need to be able to create a workforce that is educated and skilled enough to take advantage of these jobs. And this is what Professor Kundu was referring to. I mean, are we ready in the South? Are we ready with the skills that we can embrace the jobs? There's another impact that is happening, apart from the compositional effect of labor market changes that I've been talking about, technological changes in labor market. There are also this other massive change that I referred to earlier, which is the growing wage and income inequality. And that, I think, is a big cause of concern for governments. It's a cause of concern for society. And as I said, if what I said in the beginning was true, that technology is responsible for the increasing wage inequality that you see, the other manifestations that you see around the world, anti-globalization, are actually just building on the technology that is forcing labor markets to change structurally. And hopefully, we can reverse the structural change that is happening in labor markets. So this disruption of the labor markets remains the biggest social concern for governments. And one of the things that you notice if you look at the literature is that while GDP has grown, wages have not grown, productivity has grown, the share of wages in country GDP or in, if you look at different firms, the share of wages have either remained stagnant or have fallen, and the share of capital has actually increased. So technology has privileged capital over labor. And how do you begin to address this? This is the concern. Now, if you talk to trade unions, they will say that big technology has declined the bargaining power, has made the bargaining power of unions less, and therefore this shows up as a declining share of labor. And so what is the intervention that one could make if this is true? Governments often have minimum wage legislation. And quite counterintuitively, when we've spoken to trade unions, in some of the work that we've done, and people have spoken to trade unions. Trade unions said, you're replacing tasks that we've been doing by government legislation, and they're going to be less effective than trade unions. So trade unions are sort of, in some sense, contesting the declining power that they have due to technology, and insist that minimum wage legislation and other sort of good practices at the workplace should be their responsibility. But what is true is that the bargaining power of trade unions has declined. And in high-income countries, on average, the share of routine labor in employment has fallen by about 0.6 percentage points a year since 1995, which is almost 12 percentage points in the entire period. So share of routine work in total employment in developed countries has declined since 1995 by 12 percentage points. And there are signs that there is greater polarization in a number of low-income and middle-income countries. The average decline in the share of routine employment has been 0.39 percentage points in low and middle-income countries, or about 8 percentage points since 1995. So the impact of technological change in the labor market, in the share of income, non-routine income, sort of in employment, routine income in employment, is declining greater, has declined by a greater amount in developed countries than in developing countries. So the job polarization, the decoupling of wages and productivity are, as I said, symptomatic of the digital technologies that have caused a replacement of workers. And we have to see how we can augment this. So what are the policy responses that one could sort of look at? And these, again, are in the literature, have been spoken about in the literature. So some of the policy responses are, of course, talking about how the government can intervene in promote better lifeline learning, in vocational education and training, and they'll have to be the key. One talks a lot about governments investing in skilling and vocational training, but I think these will have to be the key, and they will depend upon the local context. So that's a given, and I think everybody agrees with the fact that governments need to make those investments. What people don't sort of or there is no consensus over is what is the kind of labor market institutions or the labor market flexibility which will allow us to leverage the technological change that has happened. And I think coming from India and others, South Asian countries and countries in the South where labor market institutions have been relatively inflexible, this becomes difficult. So, we are moving at a time like this, when technological change is happening, we're anyway moving from more sort of formal institutions to informal. We've already been informal, and technological change is going to push the needle on informality a lot more. And that is something that is contested a lot. Is that, a greater informality of the labor market institutions, hiring and firing, is that a way out to deal with the technological revolution that we are seeing that is disrupting the labor markets? The other thing which is also quite controversial, which has been discussed, is the nature of social protection. And in India, a couple of years ago, we had the universal basic income that was discussed, and this is something which is being discussed also in developed countries, including in some emerging markets like India. The question is whether the governments of countries like India have the tax revenue to be able to make good on universal basic income. Is universal basic income actually going to be universal, or are you going to target to specific individuals? And is targeting at all possible when you talk of social protection? But some sort of social protection will have to be designed. If it's not universal basic income, it'll have to be some form of social protection that will have to be designed to sort of accommodate the disruptive changes that are happening in the labor markets. So social protection absolutely needs to be strengthened. And the other thing that needs to be done, I think, related to the government's policy response, and this is something, it is not necessarily due to the disruptions in the labor market, but I think it will be an important complement to a host of policies that we can do, which is improving the tax to GDP ratio, improving the tax administration, so that governments that have low tax revenue to GDP can increase it, and technology can actually be a savior in this sort of domain. And we've seen the Minister of Finance in India in the last couple of weeks post-budget make announcements that the tax administration in countries like India needs to become more friendly, and so that when people are actually paying taxes, they're paying taxes, recognizes that they're getting something in return for what they're paying, but also that the transactions costs of paying taxes are actually lowered, or the compliance costs, as the literature calls it, are actually lowered. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because if you're going to design social protection policies to take account of labor market disruptions, then countries like India that often complain about the lack of fiscal space to invest in social security programs cannot use that sort of, if I were to call it an excuse, not to invest in social security programs. And therefore, I think tax policies are important, and broadening of the tax base are important. Tax policies are also important to reduce the widening income inequality that we see around the world. So I think that will have dual benefits, as it were, if the governments were able to get it right. And of course, technology is there to stay. You can't sort of wish it away, and therefore investing, again, I bring the example of India, must ensure that technologies develop in a way that benefit people. And I'm not going to get into all the aspects of technology around data protection, surveillance, etc. That is a part of the public discourse in India, even as we speak. But you need to make digital technologies as pervasive as possible, because you're not going to wish them away. And once you've made them more pervasive, then I think citizens can respond by using these technologies to become entrepreneurs, to create jobs not only for themselves, but for others. So I think there are many policy responses that I've spoken about, and I think some of them are a given that there is consensus on. Some of them sort of labor market flexibility, institutions, as well as the universal basic income or social protection. There's not as much consensus on that as yet. But, there's a new theory of sort of development, and it's related to what countries can do when there are structural changes in labor market. It's called the Scrabble theory of development, and I've become a big fan of it in the recent past. And the Scrabble theory of development basically says that if you have a larger number of letters while you're playing Scrabble, you can do a lot, you can make a lot many words and perhaps win the game. The number of words that you can make with 7 letters is, a multiple of what you can do with 2 letters. Taking that analogy, that if countries have multiple sort of competencies, then they can move to related industries and develop sort of comparative advantage in them. The other way to look at it is that development in countries like India suffers from a number of constraints, and you have to, release a number of these constraints to be actually able to move to the next level. Another way to look at it, the Scrabble theory of development, is that you develop multiple competencies. Once you've developed multiple competencies, then disruptions in the labor market or declining industries, you can move to related or close industries with less sort of transactions cost, so that you're in a sense anticipating or being ahead of the curve, which is, can you move from textiles to, let's say, shipbuilding? And the reason I bring up this example of textiles to shipbuilding, because our neighbor, Bangladesh, has been able to do this really well. So what are the opportunities since one of the sort of topics for this is what are the opportunities for cooperation in the South? And I think I'll just spell them out, and I'm sure there's going to be much more discussion on this during
wrapping up now, huh?
I'm wrapping up. This is last 2 minutes. So the scope for cooperation is sharing best practices for skill development and education, obviously. I mean, if you are going to be able to transfer skills or create skills and build skills, our experience in India shows primary education and secondary education is absolutely the key. They are complements. Skill development has to build upon good education, and education is something that people undergo not at one point in their life, but it has to be, as I said, lifelong education to be able to make use of the changes that are happening in the world. And massive online courses, I'm sure there'll be a discussion on that. That also provides an avenue for cooperation. The other sort of cooperation agenda, I think, for South-South is taxing of digital platforms. I won't go into the details, but I think digital platforms where incomes are generated, where there's a permanent establishment, where the income is generated, is something that we can learn from each other and do. And the last sort of area of cooperation that I could mention is removing the excess barriers to migration. And if we look at the global labor market, we could see if there was migration, it would be much easier to solve the labor market problems, because there are some countries that are aging and there are some countries that are, like India, still young. So sort of labor market migration globally could benefit. It would be a Pareto optimal situation. And because sort of workers who live abroad contribute back remittances which help in the development of the country as a whole and improve welfare, is something that the Global South can use to cooperate on. So let me conclude by saying that, creating, there's no gainsaying the fact that technology is actually disrupting labor markets and reshaping labor markets and the world of work like never before. It's never been seen in the past, and it's going to be a challenge for all of us. So for India, let me conclude by sort of India's point of view. So creating productive jobs for India's rapidly rising young sort of workforce is more important than ever before, because, as I said, automation is threatening to displace jobs, which makes it very worrying. However, while on the one hand, the fourth industrial revolution poses a great threat to job creation in India, it presents a big opportunity. So you can see the glass is half full or the glass is half empty, and I see the glass as half full. A vast majority of India's population is still left wanting for basic amenities like clean drinking water, 24 hours electricity, means of livelihood, education, and food for all, and the quality of primary and secondary health care. It needs to be studied whether any of the issues can be addressed or at least enabled through initiatives under the fourth industrial revolution. So I think the fourth industrial revolution and the cooperation between the Global South can be a lever to overcome some of the constraints in India and other emerging markets that I've spoken about. So digital technologies have the potential to change outcomes, truly empower people, and create more equitable growth. India and the rest of the emerging world cannot afford to squander this opportunity. Thank you very much for listening to me.
I was right in having the confidence that Dr. Kathuria will raise the key issues in a sharply focused manner. That's why I think the extra 5 minutes that you have been very well utilized by you. I thought he mentioned about, the alarmistic perspective, but he also talked about not to be too much alarmed by that. The speed of technological breakthrough and the innovations has no historical precedence in terms of its velocity, in terms of impact, systemic impact, and also in terms of impact on the labor market. And you are right in mentioning that this creates a situation in which winner takes it all. It can happen, increasing sharp inequality, but as you rightly pointed out, with the due efforts, initiatives on skill development and also on institutional reform and right kind of a policy, we should not be really squandering this opportunity. That's a very good message. I would now like Dr. Sidhu to take over to conduct the discussion from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I do have a couple of points I want to pick up on the winner-take-all part of it, but I'll reserve that for later. Or just to say, not surprisingly, as an educationist and an academic, it's music to my ears to say people have to do lifelong learning. But I think the nature of education is also going to have to change. But let me begin by, again, welcoming all of you, thanking RIS, NEST, the Ministry of External Affairs, the UN Office on South-South Cooperation, and FIC DC for putting this panel together. If any of you thought that this was one of those crazy futuristic panels that we didn't need to do for the next 10 years, I'll just point out that this morning there was a newspaper item of how the Russians have just sent a humanoid robot of 5'11" to the International Space Station. So it's very, very timely, and it's catching up with us much faster than any one of us is either ready for or is imagining. There are three buzzwords which are going to keep coming up, and I'd just like to flag them for you before I, start the deliberations and the conversation. The first is skilling. Everybody is, in the global south in particular, this is the key word for any is a kind of an overall panacea for everything related to that. The second one, as we've heard, is the fourth revolution, or as some still challenge that, we called it still the third revolution, a continuation of the same revolution. In some ways, these two are somewhat contradictory. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that as well. What are we skilling for? Are we skilling for the third revolution? Or are we actually skilling for, new jobs which are not even on the horizon at the moment? What should we be skilling for? And I just want to remind another buzzword which came up from yesterday's discussion, saying the size of the economy does not matter, innovation does. And so how we're going to innovate and move forward on that is going to be extremely critical. Let me add another word out there which has not been mentioned in that excellent background paper, and that's the gig economy. It's something that, in fact, already exists in the global south. It's something that the north is coming to terms with increasingly now, but it's something that we need to see how we could leverage in many ways as well. And last but not the least, just to set the context of this, Sustainable Development Goals 8 talk about promoting inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. Goal 9 talks about fostering innovation. And of course, Goal 17 is about revitalizing global partnerships. So with that kind of background and that sort of context, building on the superb keynote speech we just heard, I'm going to actually turn to my panelists not to make their presented remarks, but to answer very specific questions that have been posed to us and that we'd like to start the conversation on. So, Paulo, I'm actually going to start with you and say, at the moment, there is this buzzword of skilling. That's the new phrase that we're hearing all the time. Is it, in fact, time to pause and say, are we doing the right kind of skilling? Should we be reconsidering the whole approach that we have to skilling? Or in some ways that we still need to continue, and because of the nature where our economies are, what are the lessons that you think might be learned there?
Wouldn't it be fair to give them at least 2-3 minutes to make some initial
yes,
remarks if you want to?
As part of that, and then we can.
And then we can take the specific.
We can do that as well.
Make some general remarks.
2-3 always go on to 5, but yeah, I'm trying to. But go ahead, Paulo.
I was polite to say 2-3, but it should be 5. Yes.
First, let me say my words of gratitude for being here, to Sachin for inviting me for the Delhi 5 process. I have also to say that it is quite scary for me to talk about this issue with Carlos Correa in the room. I read most of his work when I was a graduate student, so it's really something embarrassing. But nevertheless, as we speak now, the BRICS Business Council has a specific working group on skills development. The name is the Skill Development Working Group. And they are meeting now, as we speak, in Kazan, in Russia. And for the meeting, the Russians prepared a presentation where they show a very interesting data. First, China is by far now the most innovative country in terms of patents related to Industry 4.0. That's one important dimension of the problem. India is coming fast in the same path, while Brazil, South Africa, Russia in the middle, but Brazil and South Africa in the bottom are being left behind in terms of innovation. But even though China is becoming a kind of a powerhouse for innovation, particularly innovation regarding digitalization, there is an enormous skill gap skills gap in China. The Russian technical and vocational education and training institutions, they made a map and they came with an indicator which they call talent future readiness. And they take 7 dimensions for that. Fundamental skill sets, lifelong employability, self-sustainability, accessible opportunities, skill liquidity, labor market inclusivity, and value-based employment. 7 dimensions. And they found that among the developing countries, the biggest challenges are fundamental skill sets and self-sustainability. They had this study, they studied 74 cases. Among the 74 cases, in the bottom of the skills gaps, the countries which the skills gaps are the larger are exactly the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and I have to add the 6th one, which is not part of the BRICS, but is there, Mexico. These 6 countries are the countries with the largest skills gap. So I would answer your question saying it is time to stop. It is time to create a knowledge platform to assess what are the gaps in these countries, what are the good experiences in these countries, and it is a very important time to do something that I think the RIS is starting to do now, which is discuss open a discussion between think tanks and universities, because we have to discuss the role of the universities in skilling for the future, skilling the future generations.
And Paulo, I'll come back to that in terms of how we go forward from where we are now. But thank you very much for that. Anita, may I? That particularly Southeast Asia is way ahead of the skilling than in other parts of the world. Just a brief sort of assessment of that, and then we'll come back to others.
Thank you, Dr. Kundu. Thank you, Dr. Sidhu. And before everything else, thank you, RIS, for making area part of Delhi Process 5, even though we do similar work in different locations. But I think the ethos and spirits and the outcomes of our work are similar. So on that note, the general note that I would like to present is that digital economy, Rajat sir, of course, elaborated very lucidly. The thing is that its effects are going to be most obvious in the corporate applications and industrial systems, and therefore on investments, hiring, and therefore skill training, and trade and investment policies in every country, especially in South. North is not precluded from this, but since we are discussing South here, so therefore. A few numbers before we move ahead. And these are the opportunities. These are not our, in any way, stop us from moving forward. Developing Asia, we have the largest labor force in the world, about 2 billion workers by 2030. India alone will be accounting for 30% of the regional labor force. Africa's working age population expected to be 1.1 billion. These are humongous numbers. And these are the numbers which we have to keep in perspective every time we are talking about digital economy, opportunities, employment-led growth, because this is the group for which we are going to create, we need to create employment. And most importantly, the topic for today, where does South-South cooperation figure in all this? How?
Could we leave
Yes.
that for a little later?
Yes.
It'd be great to get your assessment before that.
Yes. So having set that platform, how did Southeast Asia manage this? It is common sense that even Southeast Asia is not evenly developed. You have great unequal developments, but regardless, they have done much better and are a bit of a textbook example of how growth can be created. Out of cooperation, trade and investment facilitation, and skillings, which are matched with growth policies. As we understand, some basic element of skills were already present, which were a product of some element of universal school education, universal education systems, which are prevalent in most of the countries, or at least the big 6 of ASEAN. The remaining are now following the same trend. The other thing was that when the initial value chains were being created, these partly skilled labor force contributed in getting the productivity rising year after year. This was matched with a huge level of North-South cooperation, but eventually South-South cooperation also mattered, and that is where the ASEAN community experience, the ASEAN economic community, so to speak, became very important, and which is why among all the pillars in ASEAN, the ASEAN economic community were not only bringing in their development policies, regulatory policies, investment policies, and bringing a coherence among themselves and presenting it both as a model of cooperation. In this case, of course, it is more rule-bound because it's a community. So both as a cooperation as well as a policy for growth, and inherent in that is skilling and development and employment. So to that extent, ASEAN managed a perfect mix of how to create trade and investment facilitations, how to match skilling with industrial needs, and how to make use of the existing educational levels that were there, and remaining regulatory guidances and agreements followed, so to speak, the initial achievements. And that's how Southeast Asia is where it is, and providing a bit of a context to other regions in developing Asia and Africa at this point of time.
And we'll come to that in the next round that we do. Andre, let me turn to you and look at, what are the lessons learned and the experience that you've had from your perch at the STC and in some ways, the Global North as well.
Thank you very much, and I also would like to thank a lot for the invitation. It's my first time here, and it has been a very inspiring sort of day and a half so far. So let me give something back to you and look at something which is an experience from the Global North. I'm from the Swiss Development Corporation, and I'm not a skills specialist, but skills development, vocational skills development is something our agency is quite proud of, and so I can speak with conviction to that. And the skills development approach we have is very much educated by our own experience as Switzerland. As you know, Switzerland is today a very rich country with a very diverse in base of different economies, and in that sense actually quite stable. We had, when I refer to what your language, sort of a replacement effect with some of the digital transformation, and we remain quite stable. We have a very, very low youth unemployment, generally low unemployment, but also a very low youth unemployment. And when you look back 150 years, it would have been unlikely that Switzerland is at the place where it is now. It's a country which 2/3 is ice and snow and some nice mountains, and no sort of major natural resources. We didn't have any colonies, so it's a landlocked country. So it wasn't very likely, maybe 150 years, that it would become quite successful. And one of the things we believe has made it successful, apart from also some historical luck occasionally, is that we have a quite good investment in our own people and workforce. And that's not only basic education, but also a quite sort of sophisticated system of vocational training. We do have good universities, but if you look at the comparison, Switzerland doesn't send a lot of people to university. It's about 20%, which is quite low. So they are really the ones which are scientists, you know, but the normal people and also the normal workforce are not going to be the Steve Jobs or the scientists. They are going to be people who are performing in a diverse and changing environment. So we have a vocational training system which 2/3 of our youngster enroll in, which is what we call a dual system. It's in a sense a partnership between the private sector and the education system. And people who enroll there would spend maybe typically 3 days in a job, doing training on the job, and 2 days in schools. And importantly, this student system is that the curriculum of the training is actually something which is developed jointly with the respective industry. So if you would be doing a training in say, hospitality service, the training curriculum would be developed jointly with the hospitality industry and so forth. So we have about 240 different jobs you can enroll and in a formal apprentice and then finish with a diploma which work under this scheme. And as I said, it's jointly together with the industry, very often also with involvement of trade unions. And so it's actually a system which is quite resilient because it enables the whole system to react to change. On one hand, you assure that you don't invest a lot in people going through formal education and then coming out and finding out that their skills don't match the current labor market. Because at the beginning, there's a labor market match. You would actually look for a job in a company and then enroll in your education alongside. So there's a labor market match sort of by definition. And then also in terms of, you know, developing this joint curricula, the labor market reacts to changes quite quickly. So that system worked out quite well for us. It's clear it's built on very, very long tradition of the guilds in Europe, which we had the sort of the organized trade we had in Europe. So it's clear that when it comes to development cooperation, you cannot translate it one-to-one to, say, a country like Niger or Bangladesh. But the very idea that you have to sort of match and bring together the skills development and the needs of the labor market, and also have a common agreement what the skills are and how they evolve. This very idea and on the governance structure is something we are trying to emulate when we do skills development programs. So we did, for instance, programs in Bangladesh with the garment, leather industry, sort of trying to do a dual systems. We have done work on the hospitality service in Myanmar under a similar model, and we are currently signing an MOU with the ASEAN to sort of try to develop sort of skills development at the ASEAN region on a more conceptual basis. So it's something we are doing, which we think is useful, which we think can bring together skills and labor market changes and make the system more resilient. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Andrea. Just a quick, very brief follow-up question. Given the distinct nature of Revolution 4.0 and the focus on innovation, do you think that the system that exists now is resilient enough, or do you think it needs changes?
I think it's resilient enough in the sense that it puts structures in place which then collectively react to those changes. They are very disruptive, but it puts sort of a governance structure in place where the relevant people, schooling system, trade unions, and the industry have to talk to each other and find solutions. So, of course, it's still a challenge, but we have sort of a structure in place where collectively you can actually, react to that.